Okay, making his Sleepers Media Channel debut, we are pleased to be joined by Heat Check CBB founder Eli Boettger. We have argued over how to pronounce this man's last name. Just for the record, I did clarify offline, so I didn't naturally get that right, but I feel great that I just nailed it. Eli, you're going to be in the building for this game, which is super exciting. So we had to bring you on the preview. It's UConn, it's Gonzaga. UConn, everybody's lumping in their top three teams in the country right now, along with Arizona and Purdue, who play this weekend. Gonzaga, I think everybody still believes is a very good team, but after the loss to Washington a week ago, there are some questions about how this team will respond, especially when they play the best of the best on their schedule. UConn is certainly the best team remaining on their schedule. What are you expecting going into this game?
Yeah, I mean it's going to be a really fun one. I know it's a neutral floor in some regards, and I mentioned that even though it's obviously a game that's much closer to Gonzaga than it is to UConn, but UConn fans travel like crazy, and that fan base is just awesome. So I expect them to pack the house, and I expect it to be a really good crowd. But it's a big game for both teams, especially after some recent defeats. I think Gonzaga in particular. Not necessarily a bad loss, but maybe a bit of an unexpected loss to Washington this past week in a game that Gonzaga's kind of gotten used to winning the last decade or so. But it's a lot of new pieces for the Bulldogs, a lot of young players, and I think Mark Few is still really trying to get a sense of what he has in terms of depth. And he's not necessarily a coach who has a lot of depth that he's used in years past, but I do think, especially with the loss of Steel Venters in the preseason, it's a team that is a bit thinner than maybe we're used to seeing for Gonzaga. But I mean, with the way the WCC is playing out right now, after this game, besides the Kentucky Rupp game, like Gonzaga's kind of got a pretty nice schedule here from now until at least the WCC tournament. So it's kind of a stretch run if we can even call it that here in mid-December.
Yeah, it's one that I feel like prior to the Washington loss, it would have just been like a nice to have game. And now I feel like there's a little added sense of urgency of we don't want to come off of non-conference play feeling like we let a bunch of games slip. And look, they beat UCLA on a neutral. They beat USC. They have some good wins, but not a great win. And this would certainly be a great win. UConn, I alluded to it. I think a lot of people narratively are driving that this team is right up there with the best of the best in the sport this year. Obviously, they're the defending champions, but I think whoever wins Arizona Purdue is going to, by default, be the number one team in the country. I think if UConn wins this game, they will automatically be number two in the country and hold that spot. Do you think that UConn is actually that good? Do they belong at the top of the top echelon in the sport this season?
Yeah, I think if you have an upper tier of say 3, 4, 5 teams, I think UConn absolutely has to be in that conversation. It just doesn't look like they've missed a beat from last year. And what we've seen so often with reigning national champions is there is a lot of roster turnover, and there was with this UConn team, and they've lost a handful of really massive, impactful guys. But I think when you look at Tristan Newton and the step that he's made into probably being one of the short list All-American type point guards in the country, and Donovan King, who a lot of folks thought was going to be that top 5 top player nationally. And not to say that he hasn't been great, but he hasn't been to that level. And even then, I think UConn is right up there with the best of them. But when you compare these two teams, I know we'll probably get in a little bit further as far as the matchup is concerned, but it feels like Gonzaga is maybe a Cam Spencer or an Alex Caravan away from being right in that same mix that we're talking about with UConn, because again, with the loss of Venters in the preseason, I don't know if they have that knockdown shooter, but UConn does. And it seems like in every opportunity that UConn has to just, especially during this non-conference run where they've just thoroughly blown out teams, obviously, except the Kansas loss, which was a great game. But it seems like every time there's an opportunity to just end a team or just go on a 10-0 run or just hit a fast break 3 to put a team away, UConn's just checked that box every single time. And I think that's just it's a massive X factor that they have that just not a lot of teams possess. And I think that's why you have to put them on the short list of national title contenders even still after all the losses in the offseason.
Yeah, they got dudes. That's what it feels like. And I like the call back to Steel Venters because I do. When Gonzaga has struggled this year, I have come away feeling like they're missing one guy, and that's because they are missing one guy. And I think Dusty Stromer has filled in admirably. I really like how Nolan Hickman has played this year. I didn't have high expectations for him coming into the season, especially knowing that Nemhard was coming in. To me, honestly, like, Hunter Salas left the program. I was kind of rolling my eyes at the Hickman retainment of like, yeah, I just don't know if it's ever going to click. They're clearly bringing in a guy to replace his on-ball role. And instead, like, I think he's really slid over to the two, and we're seeing a better version of him than we've ever seen. Am I delusional on that? Like, am I only seeing Hickman's good moments? Does he still have the bad moments? What do you make of him this year?
I mean, it's far more consistent than what it used to be, right? Like I think it's without Hickman, I don't know where this team would be, and that seems like an odd thing to say given what the last 2 years were like. But he's stepped up and he's had his moments, but I think just collectively, the Gonzaga team in particular, the 2 and 3 spot is just going to be so important for how this season unfolds. And the floor is almost always a Sweet 16, but the ceiling can always be probably a Final Four berth. And I think Gonzaga, if they find the answer, if Hickman's going to end up being the guy at a very consistent level, and he's been efficient so far this year and done a lot of good things. If Dusty Stromer is maybe that guy who can step up, and it's asking a lot for a young player, and even Hickman's not even all that experienced to this point in his career, given the playing time he's had. But those two guys, I think, are going to be really, really important in determining what Gonzaga's ceiling is going to be like. Because I was checking before we hopped on. As of right now, this is the worst three-point shooting team that Mark Few's ever had from a percentage standpoint. So, and in years past, it's been a lot of a team that can hit a ton of threes, or they can dump it inside to a dominant big like Shemek Karnowski or Drew Timme, or in this year's instance, maybe to a little bit of a lesser extent in Graham Ike, but still a really good player. I think it's just it has to come from the perimeter at a consistent level. And if Hickman's that guy, if Stromer's that guy, I think it goes a long way in determining where Gonzaga is going to be by year's end. So,
do you believe they have that guy in the backcourt? Like, in your heart of hearts, because obviously Nemhard's a good player, obviously Nolan Hickman's a good player, but like, is either one of those guys capable of being the guy on a team that can actually make a Final Four run?
That's tough. I think on and this is going to be tough to approach, but on a random night, I think yes, because we could see Nemhard hit 30 points. We wouldn't be shocked. We could see Hickman pour it on. I don't think any of us would be all that shocked, but can this team and those guys in particular sustain a run for 3 or 4 matchups against high quality teams in March against some of the best perimeter defenders in the country? I don't know. And the other thing to turn to as well is maybe the best perimeter shooters on this team are the likes of like Ben Gregg or Braden Huff, but those are both 6'10", like stretch bigs. That's not really the type of prototypical guy that we've seen carry Gonzaga in the past. And a credit to Mark Few too, because he's been able to make the most out of his players. And I don't think he's stuck in his ways of what he needs to do, but there's got to be consistent production from the perimeter. And especially when we're talking about a Gonzaga team where it's a matter of, are we going to win 2 NCAA tournament games, or are we going to win 4? Like, we're not talking about missing the tournament here, but I don't know. It's so tough to say. And I really would have liked to have seen what this team would have looked like at full strength, because I don't know how you felt about Gonzaga preseason, or at least pre-Venter's injury, but this is a team that had a ton of experience, had some intriguing freshmen entering the year. And I think it's just a really underrated or underestimated injury that is going to impact this team long-term. And I don't know, how would you feel, at least given the pre and post injury synopsis of what Gonzaga looks like and what you've seen so far?
I definitely think it's a severe hit, but I don't know, man. There's something about it where, like, Car and I have talked about it a bunch this year. It feels like the year that Mark Few gets over the hump, which he's been in the national championship game, so I don't even know what we're talking about. Get over the hump. Like, does he need to win a title to get over the hump? I don't know. But I feel like he's just kind of due for a year where his team overachieves by default in the tournament. And that's probably because they've been a 1 seed for so many consecutive years until last year when were they a 2 or 3, I believe. Like, they've always been great. And they've always had top 5 in the country talent going back to the entire Drew Timme era and even a little bit before it. I kind of like that this year's team is one tier below that. Like, they're still a very good basketball team. They're not a finished product yet. By the end of the year, they might be. It would be great to see them at full strength. But I like, for a team to come in with less expectations, and maybe it's like, oh, a Sweet 16 would be a good year for this team. If they get to the Sweet 16, I don't want to see a Nembhard on ball at point guard. Like, that's a scary thing. So I did look it up just to see in their 2 losses, by the way. I don't think Nembhard or Hickman have been like bad in those games. They were 2 for 12 combined from 3 in the Purdue game. So you can make an argument there. But Washington, they were actually pretty good. Both of them were 4 for 9 from 2-point range. Hickman had 17 points with 3 threes. So like, I think collectively, combination of their parts together, that's a really good backcourt. Like, that's a Final Four caliber backcourt. Obviously, they have answers in the front court. But your point about the shooters, like Ben Gregg and Braden Huff might be the answers if they need more shooting. The problem is that obviously they're not Chet Holmgren. Like, Chet, you could put Chet at the 2 and it would have been like, oh, that makes sense. He can do whatever. Like, for this team, you want Watson and Ike on the floor. So it doesn't make a ton of sense to go jumbo bigs and move Watson down to play. Like, it just feels clunky to me, even if those guys are your answers from a shooting perspective.
Yeah, the other thing too, which is kind of a fascinating a different vantage point here is, and very realistically, given, I mean, Gonzaga's only lost 2 games to this point, and then in the 2 losses, they went absolutely ice cold against Purdue from deep in the Maui Invitational. I don't know how many missed threes they had in a row, and a lot of them very good looks too. So that's almost an anomaly in itself. And a game that they had led, I don't want to say by double digits, but they had a pretty sizable first half lead, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, they win that game at the Civic Center, just to be clear. If that's at the Lahaina Civic Center rim, that's it.
Maui rims.
It's over. Gonzaga wins. It's over.
Yeah. So that game could have very well gone Gonzaga's way, and that's almost, unless Purdue falls off a cliff, that's going to be a quad 1 victory come Selection Sunday. And then against Washington, I believe they missed 11 of their last 12 shots from the field and also had an 11-point lead down the stretch in that game. So, I mean, you can always play the what if game, but -2 potentially anomaly type of perimeter shooting performances in their 2 losses. I feel like the conversation would be so different if those 2 games are flipped into wins on a normal shooting night and Gonzaga's 10-0 and maybe the number 2 or number 3 team in the country to this point, and I don't know, are they favored on Friday night? Like, I feel like it's a whole different conversation. So, and that may be what this season ultimately comes down to is, are perimeter shots going to fall for this team? And by no means, I don't think it's a poor 3-point shooting team. I don't think it's a poor offensive team, but the margins are just really slim when we're talking about, is this going to be a 2 seed or a 4 seed? Are they going to be a Sweet 16 or a Final Four team? It's just, when you reach this level and this caliber of program, that's kind of what the conversations come back to.
Yeah, or are they going to finish second in the West Coast Conference as the coaches predicted, right? I mean, St. Mary's was looking like the favorite for a while in this one. So we haven't talked about the team I think is the better team yet, which we should flip over. And then I have some rapid fire matchup stuff to get to at the end. But look, UConn, when they haven't been in Allen Fieldhouse, has essentially been untouchable this season. I think that's fair. I mean, they blew out Indiana, who knows how good Indiana is. Texas, they led comfortably the entire game. North Carolina led comfortably most of that game. Like, this team is just a wagon. And even against Kansas, I mean, they were down double digits very early for pretty much the entire first half and stormed back like a 12-0 run, took a 5-point lead with 5 minutes left in that game before Allen Fieldhouse magic struck again. I think we know this team is really good. And I think when comparing them to Gonzaga, one thing that jumps out to me is they do have the guy in the backcourt. Like, unquestionably, you and I would say Tristan Newton is national title first option guard good in a way that I think we wish that Nembhard or Hickman was. But is that fair? Because I'm so impressed with what Newton has done jump wise from last year to this year.
Yeah, he's been awesome, and the reason that UConn is so good, and maybe one of the reasons or one of the primary reasons that UConn is still so good, is because Newton has seemingly taken that jump, and it's a lot. And again, this comes back to one of my semi philosophies or hills that I will die on, is that What we're seeing in college basketball nowadays is a lot of these transfers on their second year with their new team. I feel like it's when things really click. And I don't have the stats to back it at this point, but just like a freshman who's playing college basketball for the first time, it takes time to adjust to a new conference level, a new conference style of play, a new system. And Newton wasn't bad last year by any means. I mean, he's one of the top guards for a national title team, but it just feels like he's taken the next step and has just been so steady and effective in everything that he does. And he just doesn't really do much of anything at a poor level. And I think it just steadies this UConn team and has an answer for, in particular, a lot of the offense and the offensive firepower that they lost over the course of the offseason. So I think it's been awesome, and I would not be surprised at all if he's the number one point guard in the country by year's end and on the first team All-American list. I think he's that legit.
Yeah, if you would have told me that in the summer, I would have been like, I would have hung up the phone, right? But I think he was really good last year too. That's not to like crap on a kid who like, what, didn't he have a triple double last year? I believe, if I remember
I think
correctly.
so,
Like
yeah.
the kid's been great in flashes, and I do think like UConn is one of those teams. Last year, UConn is a team we're gonna look back on like a decade from now and be like, they had so many dudes. Like, whoa, like freshman Alex Caravan was like an afterthought on last year's team. And I think Caravan's awesome. Tristan Newton is like going to finish probably as an All-American this season. And last year he was at best the third option any given night. Like, it's one of those teams you just look back on like, wow, what a roster. And I don't know that we realized that until we got to the Final Four last year. We're like, oh, this team's beating everybody by 20. Like, they were a 4 seed coming into the NCAA tournament, even if a lot of people liked them. The elephant in the room for me with UConn, feel free to just laugh me off this Zoom call at this, but I'm gonna have to do it. Is Donovan Clingan actually that good? So he's obviously good, but there was a lot of like first team all like people were betting this man to win National Player of the Year as a real threat to Hunter Dickinson and Zach Edey. And I know he's coming off the injury. That might be 90% of this. I don't know. But every time I've watched this kid this year, I have not come away being like, that kid's a first team all everything guy.
Yeah, I think first thing that needs to point to is I still don't know if he's 100% healthy. I know that UConn's been a little nondescript about what his health status is like. And for someone of his size and stature, that's a really, really big deal. And especially given what he can do and how effective he uses his body as well, and what he did in the Final Four last year. I think in particular, he just seemed thoroughly dominant coming off the bench. But I don't know. It feels kind of similar to the whole, and I know these are two entirely different players, but kind of the Tyrese Proctor preseason hype, where we're betting on players who haven't even yet been in the roles that they're projected to be in, and then we're also projecting them to be the very best players in the country at their new roles, like expecting Tyrese Proctor to be the absolute guy on a Duke team, or expecting Donovan Clingan to be this massive usage dominant two-way big for a reigning national champion. Like it's setting a lot of expectations. I haven't been as thoroughly impressed with Clingan as I thought I was going to be at this point, but I do think that there are legitimate questions about where he is health-wise and whether he is fully recovered, and how he's been progressing from that regard. But it's too soon for me to abandon the ship. I think here in maybe a month or two we'll be discussing a little bit differently, but about what Donovan Clingan looks like. But I almost want to give a little bit of a shout out to Samson Johnson, who seems like every time I watch him, it's like, oh my goodness, this guy could seemingly start on every team in the country. He's been absolutely phenomenal and can jump out of the gym. And it seems like whether he's stuffing the stat sheet or not, like he impacts the game almost like what Clingan did last year. So I think that's massive, because if Clingan hasn't been maybe to our All-American standards, the fact that UConn can turn to Samson Johnson and be like, all right, we're fine, we won't miss a beat because we have all these perimeter killers, and we'll just kind of, let that go as far as the 5 position. So I don't know, where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I think Samson's clinganing. First of all, I'm glad you brought that up. That's the verb at this point. I don't know. Obviously, I hope he's fully healthy. Like I'm rooting for everyone in the country to be 100% fully healthy. And I really like everything about Donovan King. I got to interview him at the Final Four last year and was like enamored with the kid. Like he just has a personality I want the world to see. And I don't think he looks healthy. I'm happy to assign that the blame of why I don't think he's playing as good as he could be is due to injury. But at the same time, I think we've seen the tantalizing upside already. So if he is injured, we've seen the tantalizing upside through the injury. Like he had 29 points on 12 for 13 from the floor against New Hampshire. That we didn't see that last year. He opened the season this year 3 games with 12, 16, 17 points. And look, the big thing was obviously with Sonogo last year, like there wasn't a game last season that he played more than 21 minutes. And I think that was part of the narrative was he doesn't even need to get better. He just needs to play more minutes to look more productive and be this statistical superstar. And I think we have seen the minutes. Like he has multiple games with 30 minutes this year. Those games with 30 minutes didn't look that great. And I'm trying to figure out why, because I feel like if you would have just taken his production in any game from last year and multiplied it to get to 30 minutes, it would have looked better than what we've seen. So I'm still holding out hope. Like if you I don't know how much we worship KenPom here on these previews, but if you go to Klingen's KenPom page, like the 5 most similar players to who he is this year are Isaac Haas, AJ Hammonds, Hunter Dickinson, Shemet Karnowski, and Umar Ballo. Like that's obviously a fantastic center. I would just say, like, picking out one of those, the Hunter Dickinson that is comp to him this year is freshman Hunter Dickinson, which was the guy who needed some time to get where he was by the time he was sophomore Hunter Dickinson. And I guess I just sort of hoped Klingen advanced a little further than that. I expected more, but the expectations were super high. So it is what it is. In the end, it's a great thing for UConn that they look as good as they do without this unleashed Donovan Klingen, because that means guys like Cam Spencer and Alex Karaban have contributed in huge ways. We haven't even mentioned the freshmen Ball and Castle, who have battled, Castle battled injuries of his own, and both of them should be active for this game. So with that said, I have one final UConn question to you, and then we'll do some quick matchup, quick hitters. I'm looking at the guys who I think are the 4 best players on UConn. Tristan Newton, Donovan Klingen, Alex Karaban, and Cam Spencer. That's how I would rank them. You can argue the rankings. I don't really care that much. I think those are the 4 best players on the floor for this team. If you put any of those 4 guys on Gonzaga, where do they rank on Gonzaga's roster? Like, is the 4th guy on UConn the best player on Gonzaga's roster to you?
No, I don't think I can do that. But I mean, okay, if we're taking those 4, I would probably assume that would Cam Spencer be the 4th on that list?
Yeah, for me, I would put Karaban 3 and Spencer 4, but I would hear arguments for Spencer over Karaban.
Yeah, so okay, so it's probably one of those 2. And it just so happens that what Gonzaga probably needs the most is like a Spencer or Karaban archetype of a shooter. So I don't know, I'd probably put them maybe behind Watson. I mean, I feel like Watson is still massively underrated nationally, and he can absolutely take over a game. And I also expect him to do a really good job offensively against what will likely be Alex Karaban, because that is probably one of his weaknesses, is how well he can defend. I mean, I'd probably put Spencer as maybe the 3rd most impactful Gonzaga player if he's on the roster, probably behind Nembhard and Watson, maybe EK, but I don't know. Like that's probably where I stand. It's an interesting question because I think the top end talent on UConn is going to be not only better than what Gonzaga has, but what most teams have. And UConn and Gonzaga doesn't really have that prototypical NBA guy like they've had in some years past, or the maybe National Player of the Year candidate like Drew Timme. But yeah, I think that's interesting. It's just kind of funny that Spencer and Karaban are kind of like, man, if there could be a trade and you could put them on Gonzaga, like, man, we're talking national title here. So
yeah. Yeah, it's perfect fits. And it really is. I think it speaks, like, obviously UConn has other talented guys outside of the 4 we just mentioned, but I think it speaks to how high end that 4 grouping is. Like, I don't know if you go guy for guy through every team in the country's best 4 players. I don't know if there's a team that has a 4th player better than Cam Spencer. Like,
Mm.
And I'm not even the biggest Cam Spencer guy, but like Purdue might be the best team in the country, and they would kill for Cam Spencer as their third guy. So they're really, really loaded. And then on the flip side of that question, part of why I liked it, I feel like there's an argument that 4 different guys are Gonzaga's best player. And I was glad to hear your rankings, because I think I naturally would have gone Nembhard just because you have to go a Nembhard point guard. But it was interesting to hear you say Watson as 2 instead of Hickman or even Ike.
Yeah, well, and the other thing too, real quick on UConn is if your third or fourth best player is a knockdown shooter from the perimeter, then like that's such a luxury to have. And we touched a little bit on Purdue, but it kind of goes back to present day Purdue basketball and maybe the like 2019 type of team where if Ryan Klein is your third guy, if Cam Spencer is your third guy, if like any of these types of players who are just prototypical knockdown shooters are your third best player or kind of your, I don't know, third option offense, then man, the ceiling is so much higher than, and you don't have to rely on your point guards having to create baskets all the time or having to run through your center as who's a back to the basket type of guy. I think it just opens things up that much more. And it's kind of why the UConns and the Baylors and the teams are kind of running college basketball right now. So
Yeah, 100%. Look through the champions the last few years. You're going to find guys that have exactly that. All right, some quick hitters from this matchup. So tempo on different sides of the equation here. UConn loves to slow it down. They're 295th in the country in tempo this season. Gonzaga always loves to run. They're 81st in tempo this season. Which team do you see having success in this game?
I would say Gonzaga. I think it tempo-wise favors Gonzaga, and I think the best way that Gonzaga can get an advantage is in this game is just taking the rebound and just pushing it, because pretty much besides Ike, each of the other 4 guys who are going to be on the floor will be able to push the basketball. And any easy basket that you can get that doesn't involve Donovan King, Samson Johnson, and the overall athleticism of UConn's perimeter, I think is a major win for Gonzaga. And so I think that favors Gonzaga, and it has to. I think they have to push the pace to get the advantage in this game.
Completely. I think that's absolutely their best path to victory. And I think looking back at the end of this game, how successful they are in doing so could be a big part of the result of this game. Second one, this is interesting to me. Both teams on the season are making exactly 33% of their 3-point attempts. If you had to pick one of these 2 teams that finishes the season, let's say significantly higher than 33% from 3 as a team, which one would it be?
Well, it surprises me that UConn's only at 33%. That surprises me. So I'm gonna have to go UConn just because I just trust Caravan and trust Cam Spencer to more so be those types of guys than I do maybe Hickman and Nembhard to be those knockdown shooters. So I'd go UConn. I'm surprised they're not shooting a higher percentage at this point in the year.
Yeah, personnel wise, I agree, especially with how Newton's shooting it. That was a shocking number to me. But then on the flip side, you're like, well, Gonzaga teams always make threes, so like it's gonna raise at some point, even if the personnel doesn't make sense. And the one thing I would know as far as the 3-point battle goes in this game, Gonzaga significantly better 3-point defense than UConn's thus far this season. Gonzaga's holding opponents to 29% from 3. UConn actually has allowed opponents to make 37% of their threes. So interesting battle there. If Gonzaga can make some threes and push the tempo, I kind of think they have a chance this game. And last quick header from me, rebounding both these teams would consider a strength. We thought when I was on with Connor Hope doing the Gonzaga Washington preview, we thought that Gonzaga would just destroy them on the boards. Didn't really happen. Only 9 offensive rebounds in that game to Washington pulling down 11. That has me a little scared that UConn might abuse them on the boards this game. Do you think that's a fair concern?
I think it's probably a fair concern. I do expect that it's probably going to be a little bit more even keel, a little bit more balance between the two. And I mean, it's fascinating because Frank Kepnon of Washington, he was such a massive impact in terms of loose balls, deflecting shots against Gonzaga. So I don't know if we'll see kind of a similar instance with Klingon and with Samson Johnson in terms of what they can do and of similar body types, if you will. But Gonzaga gets on the offensive boards. They're 14th nationally in offensive rebounding percentage. So whatever they lack in terms of maybe defensive rebounding perspective, I do think they'll probably make up for it in second chance opportunities.
Yeah, I view this as honestly one of each team's biggest strengths coming into this game. So like if I'm circling columns to look at the end of this, how many possessions in this game, who made more threes, who won the rebounding battle? Those are my three things. All right, let's give a prediction here. Ken Pom has UConn by 2 in the semi-road game at Climate Pledge Arena. What's your prediction, Eli?
Oh man, I like that. I think I'll go UConn by 4. I think this will be a close game throughout. I think UConn just has a little bit more answers down the stretch, and I like UConn slightly in this one, but I do think it's a little too early to write off this Gonzaga team. They're legit, and they'll be pretty fired up for a really significant game in Seattle.
I like both teams. I like that prediction. I also believe UConn wins the game. Game script wise, I'm going with a very similar flow to the Gonzaga Purdue game that kicked off the Maui Invitational. I think Gonzaga jumps out to an early lead. They show the high upside that this team potentially has. But at the end of the day, for this game, for me, UConn has looked too good in neutral site games. This isn't at the Kennel. They are much closer to the finished product for me of what they will be at the end of the season. I think they are pretty much that right now. Gonzaga, I think, has some serious upside that they are still a little bit further away from. I'll buy this team big time when we get to March, but for now, give me UConn. Honestly, I think they win this game by double digits, low double digits, though. We'll see. All right, that's Eli Boettger from Heat Check CBB. Thank you so much for joining. Have fun at the game, my friend, and we'll see if we can corral you for the recap. If not, I already have a backup. Don't you worry.
I know you're on top of things, man, as always.
We love it. All right, we'll see you guys next time. Click subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our recaps and previews this season.